Hello, welcome to the Authors Club Lit Lunch Online for September 2020. My name is Chris Schuler, and I'm very pleased to be introducing Henry Hemming, whose latest book, Our Man in New York, has just come out in paperback from Quercus.
Indeed. There it is. Slightly different
Excellent.
cover.
The book deals with a covert British operation launched in 1940 during the darkest days of the Second World War to bring the United States into World War II on the side of the Allies. While President Roosevelt was in favor of going to war against Nazi Germany, American public opinion was overwhelmingly against it. And the British SOE, if I'm not wrong, launched a covert operation to change that. Henry, would you like to expand a little?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It was SOE along with MI6, and the thing I found amazing when I was researching this book was realizing just how virulently against going to war most Americans were by the summer of 1940. And I mean, so many of the things that I've grown up thinking were eternal about the special relationship simply were not. During the 1930s and certainly up to 1940, most Americans did not see Britain as a natural ally. They saw Britain more as a competitor, as a rival, but also the country which they obviously had moved away from as a result of the War of Independence and so on. And this all manifests itself in 1940 when you have the big question, the question which is dominating American politics, which is, should America come into the war, or should America just remain aloof from it? Should it adopt an isolationist stance? And the opinion polls, and obviously we should always be wary of opinion polls, but they were, if anything, they were more weighted towards the kinds of people who would say, yes, we should come in. Even these polls were saying most people are completely against the idea. And there were charismatic Americans who were really arguing the case, saying, look, this war in Europe has nothing to do with us. It doesn't affect us. It doesn't have doesn't present a military or political danger to us in America right now. And the most prominent of these was a guy called Charles Lindbergh, who most people have heard at least something about. He's best known at the time and maybe still today for flying solo across the Atlantic in 1927. And he did this in a tiny plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. And he became, I mean, the most famous man in America at that time. And he was beloved. He was I sort of liken him to a David Beckham-esque figure. So it would be like David Beckham suddenly stepping into politics and taking this sort of almost unexpected, but certainly very sort of straight down the line, patriotic view of saying this war is not for us. Now he's one of the people who I build the book around. He's the chief protagonist, if you like, for saying America should have nothing to do with getting into the war. And he's interesting for a whole load of reasons. Number one, Germany loves him. The Nazi government understands the potential of this man and understands also that they know people who are close to him, so they can try to influence his thinking. There's only been suggestions that Lindbergh might have actually personally himself been in touch with, I don't know, the German ambassador in Washington or others. But I don't think he was actually aware of ever being persuaded to take particular lines. But the people around him were certainly trying to persuade him to take a more pro-Nazi line. So there you have one half of this conflict and this argument about whether America should come into the war. And on the other side, you've got the interventionists. And as you just said in your intro, Roosevelt is the best known. Roosevelt is the chief interventionist, even if sometimes he's a little bit hesitant in being absolutely clear about what he believes. And this is roughly the situation that a new MI6 officer called Bill Stevenson begins to get an understanding of when he turns up in America in the summer of 1940. And his task, it soon becomes clear, is to try to do whatever he can without getting caught to change American public opinion. And it's really important that nobody suspects that this is that there's a British influence campaign going on. And I use that term partly because of the connotations throughout the years that follow in terms of other countries trying to operate influence campaigns. Most famously, Russia, allegedly, during the 2016 US presidential election. And what's been fascinating whilst researching this book is realizing that while the Russian campaign in 2016 was extensive, it was nothing compared to the British campaign back in 1940 and 1941. So this is the situation that Stevenson comes into. And maybe the one thing I'll say, just kind of set up the next section, is just to briefly introduce this this man who forms the other half of the book. The other, he's the lead character, the opposite, the nemesis of Charles Lindbergh. So Bill Stevenson is someone who has never previously worked in an official capacity for MI6. And he's the new head of station for MI6 in New York. And just by me describing him as an MI6 officer, most people listening will have some preconceptions of probably public school educated, sort of well-off childhood and someone who is British and English. But Stevenson is different in almost every regard. He grew up in the red light district of a remote provincial town in Canada. He came from working class Icelandic stock. His father died at the age of 4. His mother abandoned him very soon after. He had a tough childhood. He then reinvented himself. He moves over to London after the First World War, and he never talks about his past again, if he can ever help it. So he reinvents himself, and he becomes a brilliant, ruthless businessman. He makes a lot of money. But then by the mid-30s, he's, I guess, like a lot of people who made a lot of money, he realizes there's something else he wants. And he finds himself gravitating towards the world of intelligence. He wants to be taken seriously in the world of intelligence. He has his own very amateurish intelligence networks that help him get a better sense of where to invest his money as a businessman. So these are business intelligence networks. But a lot of them provide information on what's going on in Germany, in Sweden, and Norway, and other countries like that. So in the late 1930s, this begins to be of interest to SIS or MI6. And that's where he first comes to the attention of MI6. And then the head of MI6, C, takes a real punt. He decides in 1940 to send this rookie spy master, Bill Stevenson, this quite brash Canadian businessman, out to New York to run this campaign. And that's really the start of the book.
There's a family connection as well, wasn't there? He was a friend of your grandparents.
There is. He's not only that. He's a guy who effectively saved my life. He saved my dad's life shortly before all of this happened in 1938, and so without him, I would not be here. My grandparents are also Canadian. And and my grandmother especially, who was quite close to him at the time during the 1930s, she also grew up in poverty in the middle of Canada. She managed to get to university. She became a journalist, came over to London, and then met Stevenson. And so here are two people with fairly similar backgrounds. They got on, and she then asked him to become a godfather to my dad. And yeah, there's a weekend in 1938 where she goes out with my dad, age 3, and she's sort of famous within the family for sometimes being absent-minded. Anyway, she lost track of where he was, and Bill turns to her and says, "Where's your son?" And she says, "I've got no idea." He then sprints over to the other side of his house, where there is an enormous pond covered in water lilies. And he knows this is where kids often come a cropper. And the story is slightly different as I grew up. In one version, Stevenson dives in fully clothed and sort of finds my dad beneath the surface. In another, my dad is sort of beginning to drown, and all different variations thereon. Either way, the family legend is Stevenson saves my dad's life, and we all owe him a debt as a result. But I hope that hasn't made me biased in writing the book.
Would you like to elaborate a little on the methods he used to conduct this, campaign to sway public opinion in the States?
Yes, he. I mean, he starts cautiously. To begin with, he's desperate to play the part of the MI6 officer. He's trying to find his feet. But after about 9 months, there's a very distinct moment where he decides actually he's going to go for it. He's going to he takes the unilateral decision to begin an all-out influence campaign. And very soon, he has this enormous office in the Rockefeller Center in New York, which is pumping out fake news into the American news landscape. And there's some marvelous accounts of this. Ian Fleming was there briefly. David Ogilvy, the advertising man, he was part of it. And Roald Dahl was also someone who came into this office and was dazzled by what he saw, by these, this is a sort of pre-internet troll farm, but it's right in the heart of Manhattan. It's staffed by about 700 people. Roughly half of them were Canadian secretaries who were bussed in each day from a sort of quite secure accommodation, and they were told not to speak to anyone about what they were doing. And they were Canadian because this was thought to arouse less suspicion. And maybe I'll give you one example of the kinds of things they were doing. There's a raid which took place on the north coast of France in 1941, according to the New York Post, the Baltimore Sun, and a series of other respectable American papers. And this is a raid by British parachutists. They landed in this village in northern France, and it was the dead of night. They managed to overpower the German military base. They destroyed a whole series of planes, captured some German pilots. There were some French villagers who saw this raid taking place, according to the newspaper report, and were so inspired, they volunteered on the spot to fight with the British. And they all made it back to a series of waiting boats just off the coast. And they made it back to Britain before the alarm was raised, not a single casualty. And of course, you can probably guess, the entire thing never actually took place. It was a fake. And what was amazing was just how Stevenson's office managed to make this thing feel real. They turned the story. They had the skeleton of the story was sent out to them, and they were told, look, just invent, elaborate on the idea of a raid on the French coast on this particular date. So the likes of Ian Fleming and Roald Dahl got to work on this. They added all the kind of juicy, memorable details about the French villagers volunteering on the spot and so on. And then what they did not do was immediately send it over to American journalists that they knew. Instead, what they did was they handed it to a controlled radio station in America. It was called WRUL. They also handed it to a news agency, also controlled in America. So by this point, Stevenson has a covert relationship with both a news agency and a respectable radio station. And these two have agreed, in return for quite a large sum of money paid each month, to put out fake British stories. But this is the crucial thing. They don't just broadcast them into America. They do the opposite. They broadcast them into Europe. So these fake stories go from America, they're broadcast into Europe, and in Europe, they're picked up by bona fide journalists who then broadcast them back to America. And there, the editors of the Baltimore Sun, the New York Post, and so on, see the story. It's come from Europe. It sounds plausible. It's come from neutral capital cities, so they run it. And at the same time, the story is being repeated in other American outlets. So you've got the key ingredients of a fake story. Not that I want this to become a masterclass in producing fake news, but you trust the source of the story. You're hearing about it from a series of different sources, and crucially, it feels plausible.
It's a bit like money laundering, really. It's a sort of information laundering.
Exactly right. That's the and it's so funny. I've used that term several times in the book, and you keep coming across it in the news when you hear about what's allegedly going on in the US right now. Again, with Russian actors, state actors, trying to influence the political situation there. So that's one of the other things that comes across in the book. It's this is not new, and it won't go away. We live in an age of influence campaigns. The basics do not change. The basics in 1940 are the same as what they are today. Obviously, the technology changes, but the fundamentals do not. And what drew me to this subject in the first place was wanting to understand what it's actually like to be inside an influence campaign, how to actually run it, how these things work, and what the sensibility of those involved might be. And this is one of the best documented influence campaigns that we have.
They also planted stories to the effect that the Nazis were planning to take over several Latin American countries, which of course was one way, a sure way, of turning American public opinion against them because of the Monroe Doctrine and the idea that this was their sphere. They might not get the very same ideology that said that they shouldn't be getting involved in European conflicts, said that Europeans should not be getting involved in the politics of the American continent. Would you like to say a little more about that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's, I mean, the British identified in about the summer of '41 that there was an Achilles heel to this isolationist worldview. And the isolationist worldview said, A, we need to have nothing to do with what's going on in Europe. But exactly as you say, if the Europeans get involved in not just America, but the Americas, then we need to react. And again, opinion polls were utterly consistent that all isolationists said if there was evidence that Nazi Germany was about to invade, say, Brazil, then America must come into the war straight away. And this is one of these things which doesn't easily translate to today. You can't imagine Americans feeling that sort of almost proprietorial relationship with South America. But at the time, they very much did. And so Stevenson and his campaign absolutely go to town trying to make out that there are German plans afoot to take over South America. And there's one particular thing they did, which is fascinating and which actually had an impact on the shape of the war. And we know this because of how Hitler personally responded to it. And this takes the form of a particular map. There's a map of South America, which shows South America as it would look after a Nazi invasion and colonization. So you've got to imagine this. Thank you, Chris.
There we are.
Exactly. There we go. This is high tech. This, if anyone could see that, that was all of the sort of national boundaries have been redrawn. The countries have been given different names. They even have flight paths showing the Lufthansa routes around this newly colonized German South America. And the first time that most people in the world got to hear about this map was the night of the 27th of October, 1941. And the reason they heard about it was that President Roosevelt announced it in a speech that was broadcast live to the entire country and was soon relayed around the world. And he said that he'd seen this map, he'd been handed this map by his intelligence services, and this was proof, he said, proof that Germany plans to invade South America, which is why America must come into the war straight away. What we now know is that that map had in fact been produced by the composer of A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square, the future director of light entertainment at the BBC, Eric Maschwitz, who I think is one of the most wonderful characters in the book. He's brilliant and eccentric and hugely talented. And he was part of Stevenson's operation. He cooked up this map. He came up with all sorts of wonderful flourishes, like the Lufthansa routes. And also this wonderful thing, there's some marginalia, where he writes in German on the side of this map, the equivalent of a civil servant saying, this map is messed up, it's not exactly as I want it, please change this, this, and this. In other words, it gave it that verisimilitude, which convinced some people that this map was real. And so this map Roosevelt breaks the news, and the news makes it to Germany. The first thing that happens in Germany, in Berlin, there's an internal investigation to find out if this map is genuine. They then discover it's not. And so then all hell breaks loose in terms of, the most virulent condemnations of Roosevelt as a forger, as a liar, and so on. But what's fascinating is that Hitler takes this really, really badly. 2 weeks after this particular moment, he gives his first public speech, and he can talk of nothing but this map. And he says, you know, this is proof that Roosevelt is a warmonger, etc. And then 2 weeks after that, in late November 1941, there is an extraordinary but little known moment in the history of the Second World War, where Hitler says in private to Molotov, his foreign minister, he says that actually he's decided Germany needs to go to war against the United States as soon as possible. And up until then, he's been absolutely consistent that it's a huge mistake to go to war against America until Russia has been defeated. And of course, all of his military advisors are saying the same thing. They're saying it's crazy to go to war against America until Russia is out of the way. But in the light of this map, he begins to think Roosevelt might have something else up his sleeve. He begins to think Roosevelt is more provocative than he previously imagined. Up until then, I would argue, he sees Roosevelt as somebody who's shackled to the truth, who is shackled to democratic propriety and doing things the right way and accountability. But this map changes his understanding of his opponent. He tells Molotov, we need to go to war against America. 10 days later, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Later, well, the following day, America declares war on Japan. But Germany does not. And the following day, there's nothing from Berlin. And all of Hitler's advisors are saying, we have no legal obligation to come into the war against America. It's a military mistake. Monday, there's nothing. Tuesday, there's nothing. Wednesday, still no word from Berlin. And then finally, on Thursday, the 11th of December, 1941, Hitler declares war on America. And it's been described as one of the great turning points of the war. It's also described as one of his greatest mistakes. And what's, I suppose, the most revealing thing is the speech that Hitler gives in the Reichstag later that day. And he tries to explain his thinking. And there's one section where he begins to describe Roosevelt as a provocateur, as a liar, as someone who has presented outrageous falsehoods and tried to convince the world of Germany's aggression and so on. And I'd argue strongly that he's referring here to Roosevelt and the map, and that this was a crucial part of why Hitler decides to change his mind and to go to war against America. And so in one sense, MI6 plays a part in provoking Hitler to this unnecessary and this huge mistake in terms of going to war against America. But at the same time, it's something we can never fully know, because Hitler never describes exactly what he's thinking. So that is one of the things that Stevenson did in this campaign.
And I suppose in that respect, they were assisting Roosevelt, whose policy, given the state of American public opinion, was to provoke Germany into declaring war rather than to declare war himself. Well, he couldn't. Congress would have to declare war.
Exactly right. Yeah. And what's extraordinary, again, it's one of these things where when you're researching a book, there are parts that just genuinely shock you and surprise you. What's extraordinary is what happens immediately in the kind of the hours and days after America goes to war with Japan, and there's nothing from Germany. Roosevelt's been told that the moment that America and Japan are at war, Germany will come in, and yet they don't. And in the day that follows, he's in a state of panic. He's telling all of his interventionist friends, put out stories to make it clear that Germany was somehow behind Pearl Harbor, that Germany is the aggressor, Germany is the problem, and so on. And there are these extraordinary stories that go out, mostly from the White House or friends of the White House, trying to refocus the American people on Germany, because he was so worried that actually nothing would come from Germany and America would be stuck just going to war with Japan, which is not what he wanted.
So I suppose it's probably impossible to sort of completely evaluate, but how successful do you think, or how influential do you think Stevenson's campaign was in bringing America into the war?
You're right. You can't put a number on it. I would say it was very influential, but at the same time, it was only influential because there was an existing interventionist campaign. And what they were able to do was to galvanize that campaign and make that campaign go much further than they would have done otherwise. But what they also did, they played a crucial part in undermining the other side of the argument. They played a crucial part in undermining Lindbergh and the isolationists. And without that, I don't think the political situation would have been as it was by the time December 1941 comes about.
Yeah. So I think we're approaching the end of our time. Perhaps you'd just like to say where you actually uncovered all this information, because obviously it was massively classified.
Yes, it's, I mean, as with so many books that come out on intelligence these days, the National Archives, there's some fantastic material from the PUS Department of the Foreign Office, which was released only about 5-6 years ago, but which has gone virtually unmined. And that was one of the big resources. And also my grandparents' diaries played a big part in giving me a better understanding of Stevenson. Also, a whole series of memoirs which have come out. And when you often, it's a case of not so much one massive scoop, but it's bringing together a whole series of things which just haven't been brought together before in the way that you plan to do it. And I think that, but also, I guess the other thing which sort of gave me momentum in this was the current political situation and the way we think about influence campaigns today. That helped to structure what was going on.
Yes, and that gives the book its sort of kind of moral ambiguity, because on the one hand, in the present context, we think the idea of Russian intervention in the 2016 US election or the Brexit referendum as a very wrong thing. But at the same time, here were British agents doing exactly the same thing or something very similar in the United States in 1940 for what I think most of us nowadays would consider a praiseworthy cause.
Yes. And this, I'm all for moral ambiguity. I think it's an essential part of this story that hopefully as the reader goes through the book, you're from chapter to chapter thinking, this is wrong. Then you're thinking, actually, this is right. And I think, no, it's not. And yes, it is. And hopefully by the end, you come away with a conclusion. But I think, there's maybe a broader point to make just about the way we think of war stories and whether it's possible to tell a story which has a dark side as well as a sort of positive side, and to see the pair of them side by side, and not to dismiss it if it's not purely good and positive and praiseworthy. I think it's essential. I think the same goes for so much of British history. I think it's one of the problems also when we look at the British Empire. We imagine that either you think of it as entirely good or entirely bad, and same goes for elements of the Second World War. You can have dark next to light, and I think it's essential in terms of history, in terms of understanding the past.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent note on which to end. Thanks, Henry. Thank you all for tuning in to this discussion. I would heartily recommend the book, Our Man in New York, which is out in paperback. I believe it's $9.99.
Yes, although I'm pretty sure if you shop around online, without mentioning any particular websites, it's marginally cheaper.
Thank you very much indeed. And once again, thank you all.